Hello and welcome to the 41st edition of the GreenWave podcast by SYNI International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's topic is Germany's role in Europe's green hydrogen industry and the politics now shaping support for production and infrastructure across the Union. Germany likes to think of itself as Europe's industrial metronome. When the beat is steady, factories hum and policy lines up with engineering. When the beat stutters, everyone hears it. Nowhere is that more evident than in green hydrogen, where Berlin's choices ripple through investment committees from the Ruhr to Rotterdam and through ministries from Brussels to Madrid. The question in front of us is simple enough to state and demanding to answer. Is Germany now anchoring a coherent European hydrogen play, or are we improvising while the rhythm section looks for the chart? Let us start with intent. Germany's updated national hydrogen strategy targets a strong domestic platform for electrolysis and a much larger import footprint to match industrial demand. The headline figure that investors remember is a domestic electrolyzer ambition of 10 gigawatts by the end of this decade, backed by a policy suite that treats hydrogen as an industrial feedstock first, a flexibility resource for the power system. Second, and a transport fuel where it makes sense, rather than everywhere by default. The framing is pragmatic. Germany expects to import the greater share of its future hydrogen needs, even as it builds at home, because heavy industry requires volumes that renewable power and land availability inside the country cannot supply alone. If you are an engineer, that constraint feels familiar. If you are a financier, it says the offtake curve will be lumpy unless the rules create durable lead markets. Hardware is the other story, and in this case, backbone is not just a metaphor. Germany has set in motion a hydrogen core network that runs well beyond a pilot grid. The regulator has approved a plan for more than 9,000 kilometres of pipeline, with a majority coming from converted natural gas lines and a total investment tag in the high teens of billions of euros. The aim is early next decade operation, not a museum opening in a faraway year. To deal with the chicken and egg problem that bedevils every new network, Berlin worked with Brussels to clear a state aid scheme that allows the network companies to finance during the ramp-up with public guarantees and a dedicated ramp-up tariff for users. That tariff has now been set at €25 per kilowatt-hour per year for firm annual capacity. It will adjust with inflation and is designed to fill an amortization account in the early years when volumes are thin. If that sentence sounded more like a regulatory economics seminar than a podcast, good. The financing logic matters because pipelines do not move electrons and do not sell subscriptions without molecules to carry. The tariff tells industry and prospective importers that a booking price exists and that the arithmetic is not a mystery. Permitting is the other practical lever. Berlin has advanced an acceleration law that defines hydrogen infrastructure and associated facilities as being of overriding public interest. That label has concrete effects. It shortens procedures, improves the odds in court when a project is challenged, and draws a single line under fragmented approvals. Electrolyzers onshore and offshore, storage sites, import terminals for ammonia or liquid hydrogen, and production units for synthetic fuels all fall within scope. Business groups welcomed the move with a mixture of relief and a raised eyebrow. Relief because speed is the cheapest subsidy in capital-intensive sectors. The eyebrow because the law needs to be matched by changes in procurement practice and building codes so that the administrative machine turns as quickly as the press release. Securing supply for the power system also shows up in the policy chart. Germany is preparing tenders for hydrogen-ready generation to ensure capacity adequacy as coal exits and weather drives variability. The plan is to contract a fleet in the low double digits of gigawatts of new or converted plants that can initially operate on natural gas and then switch to clean hydrogen within a defined period. with support to bridge the operating cost gap once the switch happens. This ensures that there is firm plant that can run when the market calls, and that the system has long-duration options beyond today's storage technologies. Demand creation on the industrial side is equally important. Carbon contracts for difference are Germany's heavy tool here, offering 15-year support to energy-intensive companies that shift to low-emission processes. Think direct reduction in steel with clean hydrogen or novel process heat in chemicals. The contracts pay out when the cost of clean production exceeds the reference alternative, and pay back when carbon prices and market conditions invert that relationship. The new decarbonisation programme enlarges this instrument set and, crucially, normalises the use of carbon capture in sectors where no other viable route exists within investment cycles that boardrooms will approve. Policymakers in Berlin are not trying to win a purity contest. They are trying to keep industrial capacity in Europe while driving down tons of carbon. Imports deserve their own chapter because they are the politically sensitive, system-critical piece of the German plan. Berlin designed a very specific market maker called H2 Global. It runs double-sided auctions that contract long-term offtake from producers and back-to-back short-term sales into Europe, bridging the spread with public money. The first round targeted non-European supply. The second round, approved by Brussels, extends and sophisticates the mechanism and includes cooperation with the Netherlands. At the same time, Germany has set aside billions in its climate fund for future green hydrogen import support in the later part of this decade and the early years of the next one. That sounds orderly until a real-world test appears. In late September, RWE walked away from a non-binding offtake understanding with Namibia's flagship green ammonia project, citing demand that is emerging more slowly than once hoped in Europe. The company was careful and professional in its messaging. The market read the move as a reminder that the import thesis needs clear demand, pull on the ground in Europe, predictable certification rules, and credible logistics from ship to end user. That leads directly to the current debate in Brussels over the rules for what counts as renewable hydrogen and what can receive grants or premia. In the past 2 years, the Union settled the headline framework for renewable fuels of non-biological origin. Those rules are now being implemented, with wide-ranging consequences for project design. They include additionality, meaning the power you use must drive new renewable build, and time matching and location rules, so that you are not calling green what is effectively grid average. Germany's voice inside this debate has been consistently practical. Berlin pushed for longer transitional arrangements, and now signals a desire to treat low-carbon hydrogen on a more equal footing in national policy, where that accelerates decarbonisation and keeps costs within reason. That does not erase the Union's definition of renewable hydrogen. It does tell developers to plan for more than one compliance pathway inside Germany if carbon performance is real and measurable. The other big Brussels file is state aid. The Union has moved from a crisis-era, temporary framework to a clean industry framework that runs to the end of the decade, with broader tools and a stronger preference for competitive tenders. The thrust is clear. Use auctions and contracts to avoid blank check subsidies, allow large volumes of aid when the process is competitive, and steer money toward decarbonisation, clean energy, and strategic manufacturing. Germany supports that direction because a rules-based regime is the only way to keep a single market in which large states do not simply outbid smaller ones in an endless contest. At the same time, Berlin wants enough flexibility to tailor instruments like H2 Global, the hydrogen core network guarantees, and carbon contracts to local industrial realities. The past year suggests that balance is being found, with Commission approval of German schemes that are tightly drafted to avoid overcompensation and fragmentation. Now, bring in the sector's own ask list from the European Hydrogen Week conference, which concluded last week with a list of somewhat grumpy suggestions for the industry to break out of its current malaise. The sector wants enforcement of existing law, not just more text. It wants infrastructure rolled out at scale to connect producers and users across borders, not a map that stops at national frontiers. It calls for public funding that is designed for industrial decarbonisation, including an industrial bank and a long-lived hydrogen bank. And it wants lead markets that create predictable demand for green steel, green ammonia-based fertilisers, and other basic materials through procurement and standards. Finally, it asks for simplification with protection for early movers, so that projects that were permitted and financed under one set of rules are not stranded by late design changes. If you have built anything in the real world, this list will feel like it was written by people who have also built something in the real world. How does Germany score against that list? On enforcement, Berlin has work to do at home and in the European Council. The EU's Renewable Energy Directive revisions are not fully transposed across most member states, and the Commission has opened infringement procedures accordingly. That includes a nudge in Germany's direction. For an exporter of rules and compliance pride, that is a spur to get the legal plumbing finished so that companies can rely on common permitting shortcuts and hard deadlines. On infrastructure, Germany's core network is the most advanced national scheme in Europe, which is exactly what the sector asked for. The difficult piece will be interconnection with neighbours on a schedule that matches project pipelines in Denmark, the Netherlands, and further afield. Maps look clean. Cross-border projects do not. That is where council-level coordination and the European hydrogen backbone collaboration will either shine or creak. On public funding, Berlin has moved the big levers. Carbon contracts are live and being scaled. The core network has a financing regime. H2 Global is moving to a larger second round and is increasingly European in its design through cooperation with the Netherlands. The open question is whether the long-term fiscal path gives companies the confidence to commit now. Budget debates in any capital can rattle a market even when the headline numbers survive. The fix is simple to say and hard to do. Publish multi-year schedules that survive cabinet reshuffles and turn ministerial intentions into a bond-like rhythm that industry can plan around. Lead markets remain the weakest link across Europe. Germany could choose to lead here. Imagine public procurement rules that give a clear price premium for low-carbon steel or for fertilizers made with renewable ammonia. Imagine construction product standards and tenders for public buildings that prefer materials made with clean hydrogen, with the preference stated in plain language and audited. These decisions need not burden taxpayers if they are sequenced with auctions that push learning curves down. They do require political courage to put numbers into a rulebook rather than into a speech. A quick reality check belongs in this conversation. Europe's green hydrogen ambitions were always going to require a scale-up that outpaced the last energy transition. Recent analysis suggests that domestic production by the end of this decade may underdeliver relative to demand by roughly 1 million tonnes, even if the second round of auctions lands on time and budget. The European Court of Auditors, not known for hyperbole, has already questioned the realism of some of the top-line goals without a material change in permitting, power prices, and supply chain capacity. It is a reminder that the numbers must add up in euros and in electrons. Germany's tilt on the technology definition debate is instructive here. By signalling a willingness to treat low-carbon hydrogen alongside renewable hydrogen in certain national instruments, Berlin is not trying to rewrite Brussels. It is trying to ensure that heavy industry has a viable bridge rather than a cliff. Purists will object. Engineers will notice that steel made with low-carbon hydrogen still beats steel made with unabated coal, and that the former keeps a blast furnace town alive while the latter keeps a carbon budget in the red. If that bridge accelerates the arrival of fully renewable supply rather than delaying it, the atmosphere will not file a complaint. Transport policy ties back in through Europe's alternative fuels infrastructure rules, which set binding goals for hydrogen refueling stations along the main corridors and in urban nodes by the end of the decade. Germany's acceleration law covers the installations and the grid connections that go with them. The direction of travel in heavy trucks is overwhelmingly toward battery electric for most duty cycles, but a credible hydrogen refueling backbone makes sense for specific long-range and high-utilization niches, and for fleets that can source clean molecules at scale. The message to Berlin is to align station rollout with industrial clusters and ports, not to chase dots on a map for its own sake. Let us connect this back to the politics, since the question we set at the opening was about the role of the German government. 3 choices stand out. First, double down on the core network and make the tariff and booking system a living market, with transparency on capacity, interconnections, and the schedule of new sections coming online. Second, tie carbon contracts to public procurement in a way that locks in lead markets for basic materials and fuels. Third, carry the enforcement torch in the European Council. That means making the case for full and rapid transposition of the Renewables Directive provisions that accelerate permitting for both projects and the associated grids, as well as for the consistent application of hydrogen certification across borders. There is also a soft power choice. Germany can use its convening weight to push a simple message in Brussels. Protect early movers, publish fewer pages but better pages, and focus on 10-year durability rather than weekly novelty. The sector has said as much. Companies can live with strict rules if they are stable. They cannot live with ambiguity that lasts years. What about imports outside Europe? The RWE decision in Namibia is a cautionary tale, not a verdict. Imports will matter, especially for ammonia, into ports that can crack and distribute to clusters. The lesson is to marry import volumes with real demand in Europe and with infrastructure that exists on the quay and behind the gate. The other lesson is social license. Projects sited on sensitive land or without transparent engagement with local communities will face headwinds. Germany's import policy can set the tone by making human rights and biodiversity safeguards part of eligibility rather than a slide in a deck. Finally, a word about humour, because we always strive to have a little. Hydrogen debates can sound like a competition to invent the most complex acronym. If you find yourself lost between RFNBO and AFIR on your third coffee, you are in good company. The way out is to ask a dull, sounding but essential question. Does this rule help a real project to reach a final investment decision this year? And will it still make sense when the molecules start to flow? If the answer is yes, keep it. If the answer is no, ask why it is still on the books. Germany's role is ultimately to bring the EU's scale and its own industrial muscle into alignment. The core network provides the backbone. Carbon contracts and hydrogen auctions provide the demand targets. Import instruments underwrite security of supply. Permitting reform removes delay. State aid rules discipline the money. Lead markets anchor confidence. None of this is glamorous. All of it is the work that turns strategy into steel, chemicals, and clean kilowatt hours when it counts. Germany's cadence in the next year will set the tone for Europe. If Berlin combines discipline at home with constructive leadership in Brussels, the sector will have what it needs. If we drift into relitigating definitions while procurement stalls and pipelines wait for signatures, the only growth market will be for acronyms. The stakes are measured in jobs, in investment decisions that will not be taken twice, and in the credibility of a continent that has promised to decarbonise while staying an industrial power. The metronome should keep time. Well, that's a wrap on our 41st GreenWave podcast episode. We always appreciate you sharing your time with us. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM, and feel free to share with friends. We'd love if you would leave us a 5-star review. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette, you can always catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.